modeling definition. And Jason, do you have some thoughts based on your experience on what you're seeing when it comes to threat modeling as you speak to people in your space?
Yeah, so first and foremost, when I think of threat modeling, and especially the way that we talk about it with stakeholders and with students, of course, is looking at how do you identify the assets that are within your organization that require protection, right? And in addition to that, we then look at how do we see threats to those assets. What are the different ways that those assets can be threatened, and what requirements then do we need in order to have that protection, right? So it's really about asset identification, threat identification, and then ultimately arriving at requirements for how to address the threats to your assets.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, when we talk about threat modeling, um, many times we'll get into discussions and it would appear that the discussion is really about creating a particular artifact. It may just be, for example, generating requirements, or it may be the creation of some kind of a data flow diagram, or it may be misuse cases, for example. But if we really take a look at threat modeling in its entirety, it's really about identifying what are those critical assets, and then identifying what's important ultimately to the business, and seeing what we can do from a threat perspective against those assets, which brings up some interesting ideas now around how do I identify what is important to the business. So even though we talk about asset identification, it's identifying those assets which are critical to the business at the end of the day. And when we talk about generating these requirements for mitigation, the question becomes, how do we go in and how do we generate these requirements ultimately as mitigations that make sense to the business? Oftentimes, when we talk about threat modeling, approaching it from this broader perspective can bring several additional stakeholders into this discussion, and not limiting threat modeling just to what we see within a design community, for example. And as we talk about threat modeling, and as we consider this as being a core part of how threat modeling is conducted, when we look at an organization, typically we've got a broad group of stakeholders. We've got those that are practitioners. They might sit on the on machines where they're conducting their activities on a day-to-day basis. We may have managers, directors, program managers, and then we've got executives, and then above them we've even got board members. And I think it's important to kind of talk at this point about what does it mean when we talk about value to various stakeholders. Um, Jason, you got any thoughts about this?
Well, I think this is always one of the main challenges when we think about threat modeling, right? Is because we have these various stakeholders, often they don't always speak the same language. They don't always view these activities in the same way. So for example, when we think about a developer, right? They're worried about the requirements that they have to implement, the basic tasks that they need to perform in order to help improve the security of the system, right? But when we think about someone in more of a management role, right? You mentioned a few examples of that. Um, they're worried more about how does this actually improve things to lower our losses, lower our risk, and effectively cover the bottom line, so to speak. And one of the big challenges that I've seen in my own research work is getting these folks on the same page to think about the value that these activities actually bring into um, building security into the systems that they're developing. When you think from the managerial side, right, how much is this activity going to cost us, and what's the resulting benefit of that, right? Whereas the developer may simply be, just tell me what I need to do, right? That sometimes is the attitude that they have. So I think there is varying values to these different stakeholders, and of course, one of the challenges is how do you reconcile all these different views?
Yeah, absolutely. Hold that thought. We're getting to that, Jason. So,
Sure.
if we take a look at executives, oftentimes when I've had discussions and we'll talk to a chief risk officer, for example, or we'll talk to other executives, CIOs, there are things that they are focused on, which are largely based on business alignment, for example. And how do we go in? When we talk about business alignment, we can't leave it as this vague notion of we just need to align. We have to be very specific what we mean when we talk about this. And there are issues around, for example, compliance. Any breach of compliance from an executive's perspective who is now accountable, for example, from a privacy standpoint, that becomes a meaningful contribution when we conduct our threat modeling activities to ensure that we're addressing what that particular executive is looking for, or team of executives in many cases. So there are other things as well when we look at business alignment that tie into the notion of risk. And I know that there are many different ways of conducting risk analysis. We've got quantitative, qualitative ways of doing it. And this particular webinar isn't focused on what are the different ways to conduct a risk assessment, but rather once you've completed that risk assessment, how could you go in and make a meaningful creation of insights that can then go up to these executives for them to make some informed decisions? And not only that, but if we take a look at the board members as an example, now the board members are there and they're also ultimately now looking at what does it mean from the perspective of resiliency. We are finding in many cases that organizations are using this posture of an assumed breach. So if it turns out that we are breached, are we still able to conduct our business on an ongoing basis? Do we find that we've got the resiliency to be able to go in and recover from an event that happened, as an example? And that's where, from a risk perspective, we need to make sure that when we conduct our threat modeling activities, right, when we do the asset identification, we've got the asset protection, we're dealing with the threats to these individual assets that we've got. And we need to make sure that ultimately it's going to tie into looking at what does it mean from the perspective of what each of these stakeholders is looking for. And I think when we did this analysis internally and we focused on what are each of these groups looking for, there is a common element when we talk about security, where we talk about threats, we look at things like mitigations, but what that means from the perspective of each of these stakeholders is quite different, actually. A threat to an executive is the business will come to a halt, or we may get a serious fine by a regulatory body as a result of something. We might have reputational damage, for example. So these are the kinds of things that we need to start to pull into our discussions around threat modeling. And it helps us to focus and to filter on those things that are ultimately most important. Um, Otherwise, what may end up happening is we may end up with many different threat modelers looking at a particular system and trying to generate a set of requirements or mitigations because they think that that's what's most important. And it's not that it's not important, but is it in light of where the business is headed and what the business priorities are, is that really truly something that we need to focus on like right now in this next sprint, for example? And so that becomes an interesting question to now go in and try and address it to, across these various stakeholders. I think it's important to reflect on the fact that when we look at all of these stakeholders, um, threat modeling is something that is really moving towards greater and greater democratization. And what we mean by that is there are more people across the organization that are now having input into what a threat model is. And so the way that we conduct ourselves from a threat modeling perspective is we ultimately try and drive it through a knowledge base of some kind. So Jason, are you finding that from your perspective, as you're conversing with people, that you're also seeing that this idea of a knowledge base where we've got all of the information coming in and people can query this information to extract out the insights that they're looking for to make decisions? Is that kind of the approach that you're seeing, or is it not something you're seeing?
Yeah, that is something we're seeing. That's actually something we've been working on lately, actually. Is really we have a lot of rich data sets about threats that we've seen in the wild, right? And I mean, the list can go on, but you can think of things like the National Vulnerability Database. You can
Hmm.
think about KPEC or MITRE ATT&CK and all of these sorts of sources of information. And when you think about the threat modeling activity, right, one of the challenges is to identify some of these threats, especially when you've perhaps come up with some of the initial security requirements or perhaps some design decisions for a system that you're developing. And one of the questions is, well, how do you know whether those are even adequate for what we're trying to protect against, right? And we can look and we can use these knowledge sources, right? These data sources to identify whether there are particular threats that we should be paying attention to. Now, that being said, anyone who has worked with these data sources could attest to the fact that they are mountains and mountains of information. And to expect people to sit there and sift through everything over and over and over again is extraordinarily time consuming. So my team, for example, has been looking at approaches for querying these data sources, distilling this information down for various stakeholders to enable them to make informed decisions about what requirements should be in place to address specific kinds of threats to specific design decisions that you might make, right? So you might say, well, I'm going to run a Linux web server with some other technologies, for example. Well, we know that there's plenty of threats that target those specific technologies. So what kinds of protections should we have in place? And our approaches, at least, are cross-referencing existing standards that are prescribing certain mitigations for those kinds of threats. So in short, we're really missing out if we're not using these existing knowledge sources. They are there. It's just how can we make them work for us rather than be this mountain to climb,
Yeah,
right?
so in essence, I mean, there, if we look at, um, for example, the atomic requirements that a developer needs, there has been some work already done by various communities, and we can extract some of this information out. For example, focusing on SQL injection. Now, what we need to do is let's focus on SQL injection in the context of this particular web application, as an example. And so we've essentially accelerated the threat modeling activity where we could go in and at least at a base level, let's get some of these things going. And then if there's something else we need to take a look at, it's not a problem going back and conducting some more extensive threat modeling. But if we try and start from zero every time, then there's an awful lot of waste that's now happening because there's been some work that's already done in the industry. Why not leverage some of those efforts and try and pull that in as an example? And I think this now touches on an important aspect, which is all about this notion of value streams. When we talk about value streams, really value streams are a series of activities that we put together, and each of these activities are aimed at producing something that is going to contribute value back to the end consumer. In this case, it may be someone on the development side, someone on the managerial side, or an executive or a board member. But if we end up with a value stream where there are activities being done and it's offering little to no value, we might actually be very busy. But the problem is we're not able to go in there and make a meaningful contribution towards delivering that value. And I think in the discussions that I've been having, Jason, this is part of what I'm seeing. We've got a lot of these security activities that are taking place around threat modeling. When we go to an executive and we present the results of a threat model in the form of, let's say, a mitigation, the value in producing that may seem like it's high for someone from the security domain, but to an executive who thinks more in terms of resiliency and risk, that translation needs to occur. Otherwise, the perception is that this is not making sense, and I'm not seeing the value in all of this effort that's coming out of it. And so I think it's important for us to just consider now what we mean when we talk about these individual value streams. And it is absolutely tied to the processes. A value stream is a series of activities, as I've mentioned, and these activities consist of specific processes. So as an example, if we are in a low level of maturity around threat modeling, as an example, then to try to aim for something that is beyond our maturity level to try and come up with something around a mitigation may in fact not offer the same value because we don't have those capabilities internally within the organization to mitigate those, right? Why don't we focus on simpler things that we can now start to build up towards, as an example, and that might be something that would be quite helpful and useful from that perspective. So Jason, you've got thoughts around value streams at all, around threat modeling value streams?
Yeah, this is something that I have a little bit less experience in, specifically in this context. However, I do very much agree with the point that when you come with a list of mitigations, for example, as an artifact from a threat modeling activity, um, it's often very difficult to determine what priority those mitigations should actually have because they can be misleading, right? For instance, I'll give just a simple and perhaps rather crude example of this, but you could go ahead and you can have all kinds of technical mitigations about how you're going to secure your systems from a technical perspective. And one of the mitigations could be simply having training and awareness programs for your employees so that they don't do silly things, right? And when you consider the value stream, yeah, the training, the awareness, it's going to take time, it's going to cost a little bit to set it all up, but there's many sources that suggest that that would eliminate much of the risk that you would see in an organizational perspective, right? Um, and that's not always apparent, right? Because those costs, those benefits are not always the same for each individual organization, of course. And the different kinds of mitigations sort of get scattered all over the place, depending on what kinds of systems you're dealing with, what kinds of data you're dealing with, and so on.
Yeah.
So it's a really challenging view of this problem, but I think it's certainly an important way to think about this problem.
Yeah, I'd like to ask Malu as well. I mean, Malu, you've dealt with folks that are all the way up at the board level, executives. When we talk about the generation of these value streams, right, it's important that we construct this in a way that is meaningful, and we don't really waste a lot of effort or time in doing work, but that work isn't necessarily contributing in some way to the overall value. Can you speak a little bit from your experience? Like, what do you think?
Sure. Well, the way I see it is exactly the way you describe it. The problem is that we don't have a playbook upon which organizations can actually either do a bottom-up education as to where the threats are and how to mitigate, or a top-down guidance in the case of a board of directors, right? Where in many cases, an example, recently I just did one for a bank, where they're responsible for FFIEC, right?
Mm-hmm.
Compliance. And so how do you translate the context of a business from the board to the CEO, to the CIO, to all of the folks that are actually putting digital solutions in, to the folks that actually do the coding, to the folks that actually do the pen test, the threat modeling, the pen testing? That's the problem. So the way to think of it, and I'm just going to follow the conversation with what you're displaying here, is you a threat modeling definition, yes, has to include asset identification, protection, a mapping of the threats to the assets and the requirements to mitigate them. The question is, okay, now take a click down. Asset identification. An asset doesn't stand on its own without a context of a work stream, as you put it very well said. A value stream is a work stream. A work stream is a process stream. So the way that I like to do threat modeling, strategic threat modeling, because you don't want to, boil the ocean and then have no meaningful output in terms of contextual value to the business, would be to define the golden jewels that you got to protect. So that might be, let's say that you're a product company, right? And you make, you know, switches, or you have a cloud solution, or whatever it is that you do, is from the product master, data governance product master, what are the key products that I care the most about? And then let me follow the value stream, as you call it, because to get value, it means that value is an outcome of a process. The stream is the process. So when we say value stream, value is the business value outcome of that process. So follow my thinking. What is the process
Yep.
to build that asset, right? From R&D to, beginning of life, to manufacturing, to ship, to end of life. Build it out in a workflow, right? And then start figuring out what are the key, as I call them, moments of truth. And a moment of truth is as you assess the threats, your bullet 3, against those particular moments of truth for that asset in the workflow, they find now what that scenario looks like. And it's by doing this particular exercise that your requirements to mitigate, your last point, may change along the steps of that workflow, that process, to ultimately have value out delivered out of this value stream, right? And so the value of threat modeling, to me, increases the better you get on doing what I just talked about. And I have to bring, right, Six Sigma and Lean and operational excellence concepts to this, because I'm living it as we speak. I'm a president of CryptoPwn LLC. I do research and advisory because I'm passionate about these topics, but I also happen to work for a very, very large consulting company, right, that delivers these kinds of services to many companies. And so it's a difficult challenge that you're playing with, but I would say threat modeling, defining threat modeling, is less of an interest to me to get value out of a value stream, as it would be more of a business process modeling definition upon which your assets are identified and your key moments of truth in terms of risk are identified across that business process.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we've stepped into it now, so we might as well talk about it. Let's go into governance, right? So when we start to deal with governance, we're now talking about individual assets, the actual business process that is required in the generation of the value that we're looking for, right? So again, the goal is to talk about threat modeling, but is threat modeling producing value ultimately to what the business is looking for? Can we make a meaningful contribution that says, hey, there are 2 or 3 options. Here's what we recommend as a mitigation. Here are the risks associated with that. And you start to engage in that type of a discussion where you're on the same side as where the business is kind of headed. And it becomes, in a sense, an enabler for what the business is now looking for. So as we talk about governance, there are many different levels of governance. We've got, first of all, at the strategic level, if we look at a CIO or a CTO, for example, they would look at governance in the lens of threat modeling, really from the perspective of capabilities. What capabilities do we need to build in so that we can deliver the value according to these value streams? Now, when we take a look at the capabilities, many times the discussion is a technical discussion. Well, we need to understand our systems, we need to understand cryptography, things like that. But there's actually much more to that, based even on the short conversation we've had today. There's asset management, there's risk management, right? There's vulnerability management. So let me just pause there and let me start with you, Malu. Like, can you talk a little bit from your experience about the governance of all of this insofar as we're trying to identify the threats to enable the business and to help them to understand so that they can make an informed decision?
Sure. I would like to look at your second column. I think that my prior comments addressed your first column and the the value stream question very well, right? In terms of context of threat modeling. And so to me, now you're touching on the value to stakeholders in itself needs to be governed, because otherwise you're doing a really poor job in governance, right? So how do you govern? And you cannot govern what you cannot manage, and you cannot manage what you cannot measure. So
we're getting there.
Back to that, right?
I'll put it down.
So my biggest, right? So my biggest, I would say my biggest contribution in the way I think to this panel is to look at what's important to the stakeholders. So if it's a board wants resiliency, yes, but a board also is accountable so that their company can continue to operate to certain regulatory frameworks. And so let's touch on the third column. You're talking about MITRE, you're talking about OWASP, but the board doesn't care about that. That is just, noodle words to them. The board cares about, when am I going to get a letter that says I'm going to shut down and I cannot operate my business. So it's important to govern in context of the level of the stakeholder. So you govern at the level that matters to them. A board, I just mentioned the example of a bank. A bank is regulated by the FIC construct, and that is the framework they use. So create a measurement system that resonates with them and build your risk strategy around that, and then bring your CMMI level 1 through 5 against the capabilities in that framework. And that's the conversation to have with the board. Supporting elements include all of your software assets that need to support, that need to be covered. And we just talked about, how do you make sure you're protecting the most important thing, right? We can talk about levels of services and level of protection and risk management in another session. But that's, to me, governance. The governance that you expect, say, a developer to have is going to be a very different framework than the board. If you get down to the manager and the developer level, then I would say, yes, your KBs are correct in MITRE and OWASP. A manager cares more about MITRE, a developer cares about OWASP. An executive would care more about, say, ISO 27001 or GDPR, or, if you're in DoD, right, in the CMMC. And so it's the ability to understand governance frameworks that are appropriate to the stakeholder level of responsibility and an accountable role, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And therein lies some of the challenges that we see, where the governance that we currently have isn't quite integrated in a way that permits the opportunity to go in and have these kinds of discussions. Let me just turn to you, Jason, from your perspective. Do you run into any of the governance related issues where you might have teams at the developer level conducting their threat modeling activities only to find that it appears, or at least the perception is, that nobody seems to be listening? Is that at all, does that come up?
It comes up only to the extent, and I agree with some of the previous comments, right, is that the governance does have to go to the level of the stakeholders. And this comes back to a previous comment I made, that all these different stakeholders somehow speak a different language from one another. And there are certain keywords that they like to hear that enable them to really understand what's going on. So my experience with this has been in academic research, right? Especially from an engineering perspective. We talk about threat modeling and we talk about all of these issues in a certain jargon, so to speak. But talking with government agencies and regulators, for example, what I'll call the policymakers, if you will, they speak a different language than we do. They're saying the exact same thing, but just in a totally different vocabulary. And that is where I find the conflict arises, is because the engineers get frustrated saying the policymakers don't understand what we're trying to do, and the policymakers are saying, I don't understand what these engineers are talking about. And you just need to break down that barrier and have those two groups. And again, this could expand and cover more groups than just engineers, policymakers, so to speak. but really break down that barrier and have those groups realize we're all reaching for the same objective. That's where my experience has really emphasized this point, is that we just need that common language.
Interesting. So we're all reaching to the common goal. That's a bit vague. We need to get more detailed. So Malou, you started to open up the conversation around metrics here. Can you talk a little bit from your thoughts, like, your experience around this? What is that? What is that compass? How do we directionally guide, this threat modeling activity or capability that we're trying to put in place? How do we go about doing that? How do we measure it?
So I'd like to tee off from the comment that Jason just made, because Jason, you're spot on. So we talked about governance levels, right? The level of thinking and the level of framework and the level of role. If you were to create swim lanes for the actors, right? You have a developer actor, a manager actor, an executive actor, a board actor, as an example, right? Mapping the frameworks is the first step. Decomposing the framework from the board all the way down to the developer level, and then in other words, it's a disaggregation exercise. You also need to do the aggregation exercise depending on who's driving the risk management activity. If the risk management activity starts from the bottom of the organization, then obviously it needs to aggregate up, and it's through that convergence of dialogue that you're talking about that we have the most challenge. What's worked for me to solve this problem, and I actually lived it for 6 years at Microsoft when I was general manager of quality and business and operational excellence there, was how do you bring technology in to solve really big risks across products and services? It's a very vague type of role, right? So the idea is you start with the problem, and then you disaggregate it or you aggregate it depending on who are the stakeholders that care about it, right? So you're not going to get to metrics without having a stakeholder that cares. Otherwise, it's just going to be one more worry on your desk that you never get to. So there's an approach to this metrics, and it's called the SOAP, the strategy on a page. And the way you do that is you begin with the business outcome, the value outcome that you want, and then you work on disaggregating it basically, right? And it works backward also from disaggregation to aggregation. But it's through the strategy on a page that you can start then defining what are the metrics that matter, right? To the business, ultimately to that value stream that we started talking about, in a meaningful and measurable way. And metrics are cascading metrics then that match that SOAP, right? You first need to figure out the objective where you can measure it. The way you measure at a board level, the way you measure risk at a board level is very different than you would measure it at a developer, pen test level, right? To support a threat model. And so cascading your metrics across the right level of the stakeholders and then working them down through that SOAP is important.
So we talk about cascading, we talk about aggregating. I'd like to press on that a little bit. So Malou, you talked about identifying what are the problems that these stakeholder groups have, and then you construct some value stream to address those challenges, and then you measure against the problem itself. It's not done in a vacuum. You go back and you say, if we were to do it this way, would that be a meaningful contribution? And therein lies the value. Well, let's now start to measure and put metrics around those specific problems. Many times, especially when we start to take a look at pipelines, DevOps pipelines, DevSecOps pipelines, there's a lot of emphasis on delivery or features, or even in the case of a threat model, how many of these things were mitigated before we ended up moving into production. And that's okay. That'll work for a developer, perhaps a manager, but by the time you get up to an executive, to your point, they're thinking more in terms of breach of compliance. So if
Oh,
that's what we're
absolutely.
looking for, then we need a way now to go in these rapidly moving pipelines to be able to extract out compliance related information in a dashboard that the executive can make sense of. And this is the kind of thing that now needs to happen, which is focused on the problem, but it gets disaggregated as we move downwards as these teams are working in their pipelines. Did I understand what you're saying correctly? Is this what you're seeing?
Completely. And I'll give you an example. I'll give you an example of a very tactical metric
Mhm.
that would explain the conversation we're having here. Let's say that your golden jewel is this next SKU that you're going to launch to market, right? And your company X, and you're going to invest, you're pivoting to invest in a new type of technology, you're going to give it a SKU, and you're going to push it out to manufacture, and then you gotta manage it through this SDLC, right?
Mhm.
Rapid iterations. Well, in all of these, that SKU is going to appear many times across the code, across the business process, across every app that will need to consume it, right?
Mhm.
Across many systems. So now your development team is responsible for cyber securing the environment that they operate on, but they might not have any context of the product that is the golden jewel. So the way you would threat model to protect that particular SKU might be very different than protecting every SKU that goes through, through their desk as they're doing the pen test activities. So it's a matter of thinking, do I want a broad solution across, say, all BII and scan for specific patterns in code that appear that might not have all of the different elements of OWASP and all the different things I want to test against? Or maybe I need something more specific, like I want to count the number of iterations that this particular SKU appears throughout every application. And then maybe I want to do a different security construct just for that, above and beyond our traditional pen test and threat modeling activities.
Mhm.
Why? Because it might be easier to do it that way than try to change the way everybody does everything they do every day, right?
Mhm. Mhm. And it's interesting. I think this now kind of bounces us back a little bit on the governance side, and I'd like to pick your brain, Jason, on this a little bit. Um, when we talk about looking at the governance, you can't escape the fact that the data resides in individual systems, and the goal is to extract information from these systems, which in many cases is siloed. And to Malu's point, we need to aggregate, disaggregate accordingly. But from your perspective, Jason, when you look at the systems that we've got that people are using across the secure lifecycle of developing our applications, are you finding that the integrations, the architecture of these systems is largely disaggregated at the systems level? Do you have any thoughts on that? Are we seeing a movement towards greater integration or an interest towards doing that?
So in my experience, there's been stakeholders who have described an interest to integrate various metrics, because at the end of the day, let's face it, right? We don't want to look at a bunch of different data points. We sort of want the thermometer that says, are we doing a good job, right? But while they want that, obtaining such an integrated metric, in the form of a thermometer or barometer of the security of a system, for example, in my own opinion, is spurious at best, right? Because the way in which you combine different pieces of information, and Malu alluded to this as well, is that there's a context to a lot of these different things. That means that you can't just aggregate them, integrate them all in the same fashion. At the end of the day, when we're coming up with security metrics, we need to ensure that they're sound, right? And what this means is that they have to have a scientific basis in their formulation, and they're obtained from this systematic, repeatable, verifiable process. When we look at different kinds of security metrics that we often use in understanding things from a threat modeling perspective, One that comes immediately to mind is CVSS, for example, the Common Vulnerability Scoring System. You see this in a lot of different knowledge bases. It's used quite extensively, but it's not, strictly speaking, the most objective way of measuring a vulnerability. There is bias, there's subjectivity that goes into the way you score vulnerabilities using CVSS. And this is widely criticized in the literature. We see it quite a lot, but despite that, it's still used very widely. The point to be made here is that we need to ensure that when we are using these more aggregated views of different elements of our systems, we want to make sure that we maintain the contextual relevance and that we're simply providing something that's actionable for decision makers, right? Because that's at the end of the day why we're coming up with metrics, is we want to be able to make decisions. And the decisions could be as simple as, are we doing a good job? Yes, let's continue, or no, let's stop and do something different. But really, that's where I've seen a lot of challenge with this security metric business. From a research perspective, this is something we've looked at quite a lot, and this notion of soundness is something we're really putting a lot of effort into to help guide practitioners in adopting these metrics and understanding sort of the caveats that exist with them.
Yeah, it's. I think you touched on a few really key points here, Jason. Like the fact that it needs to be repeatable and verifiable implies that we need some level of automation to drive, the human element out of this. It doesn't mean we can exclude it entirely, because we're dealing with, especially as we get to more and more abstract notions around things like compliance, for example, there will have to be some interpretation put in, but that interpretation needs to be guided by a policy. And at least from my perspective, what I'm finding is this whole idea of security is evolving. It's not something where you let's put a perimeter around our assets and that's good enough. It's actually moving towards the notion of this is going to be policy driven, because organizations are moving. They're not static, they are growing. We merge, we go in and we spin off organizations. We have people coming in, sometimes we have co-opetition happening. So there are many use cases. When we start to think about threat modeling, we really truly need to look at how we're going to scale threat modeling to help us enable the business in terms of where they're going with all of this, right? And so looking at this idea of being repeatable and verifiable becomes important. To Malou's point, if we were to start at the top and disaggregate downward, there should be an opportunity to go in and say, aha, this is what we see as a risk from a compliance standpoint. Well, where'd you get that from? So you double click and you get to the next level, and you get down to the program level, and you get down to the project level, you get down to the asset, and you can drill down, and you now start to see where you've got some of these gaps. And that becomes important from a governance standpoint, because eventually, if you're looking at further investments, it might require new tooling, it might require new training, it might require an integration that needs to happen. We haven't even touched on what does it mean for an application portfolio in its entirety as you rationalize towards greater security, which would imply simplification of the infrastructure, for example, or looking at how do we go in there and assess portfolio risk. Maybe we can have that in a future webinar, but for the purposes of threat modeling, the goal today, at least one of them, was to open up our minds to think about threat modeling beyond the traditional way of looking at threat modeling around a specific asset or a few assets, but we're now starting to talk about things that go way beyond just the technical domain. And we're starting to see these things coming up from a business standpoint, also looking at it from the board perspective as well. And they are bona fide stakeholders in this. We used to think that software development was largely a technical activity, but it's become very much ingrained in organizations. And we're seeing security and compliance being in the same vein now as well. Right. So as we look at this is kind of where things are evolving at this point. As we kind of take a look at threat modeling and we try and put all of this together, You know, I know, Ihan, from your perspective, you go in and you deal a lot with people that talk about it from a risk perspective. Can you offer just one final thought when you look at threat modeling and security risk, and how this ties in now ultimately to where businesses need to focus and how we need to govern all of this? Do you have any final thoughts about how we can tie in risk mitigations, compliance, all of these together?
Are you asking? Oh, are you asking me, or were you asking
No, I
Jason?
was asking Ihan. Yep.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Thanks. Altas, organizations know very well that if they don't invest in risk management activities, no matter which business they are in, it's always and always a risky business, right? So as a powerful risk assessment exercise, this threat modeling provides organizations detailed knowledge about possible threats that might kind of harm their organizational assets. And there is no wealth like knowledge and no poverty like ignorance. And if the organizations are arming their kind of stakeholders, as you mentioned, that these not included only kind of just for the software development teams, and the capabilities and the motivations of the threat actors and opportunities that available to them, then organizations can kind of proactively build secure systems which are resistant to the possible threats over there, right? I always say this: prevention is always better than and always cheaper than the cure, right? So identifying how and where these threat actors can kind of succeed in addressing these kind of weak spots as early as possible, right? And then the threat actors will eliminate higher remediation costs and possible regulatory fines over there. You're absolutely right. Securities is tying a lot with the kind of the compliance, although they are not the same thing, right? And this can be kind of just handled over there as well.
Wonderful. That's great. Well, we've come up to the end of our discussion today. I want to thank our esteemed panelists for taking the time to talk to us today. Thank you so much. At this point, I'd like to hand it over to Eleanor, and she's got part of the presentation that she would like to take us through as well. Eleanor, all yours.
Thank you, Altas. That was a great panel discussion. Let me just present my slides. I'm assuming everyone, you guys can see that my screen?
Yes.
All good, Altas? Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Eleanor Lee, Senior Product Marketing Manager at Security Compass. I'm going to talk briefly about how SD Elements automates threat modeling activities to help organizations move towards DevSecOps. Let me start with some interesting research findings. In May 2021, we surveyed over 200 executives and participants from diverse functions: cyber and InfoSec, development, DevOps, compliance, risk management, and audit. Majority of the respondents indicated that they create diagrams as part of their threat modeling process on applications they build. They also shared the top challenges they face internally with their threat modeling activities. The top challenge they face is difficulty integrating with other technologies, and along with it, there's a lack of consistency, and it takes too much time to do. Interestingly, when we did a deeper dive and asked a group of security leaders, what is the #1 challenge about diagrammatic threat modeling activities that is giving you the most heartache? And their response: it is too manual. So what is SD Elements, and how does SD Elements help organizations overcome these challenges? SD Elements is a technology platform that automates threat modeling activities to ultimately help you reduce cyber risk and also improve compliance across your portfolio. As a balanced development automation platform, our SD Elements injects automation as early as possible in the threat modeling and development process to significantly reduce manual efforts, drive consistency, and enable collaboration among security, development, and other critical stakeholders. So from a threat modeling lens, SD Elements gives you 2 key benefits: scalability and cost reduction. Let me tell you more. So on scalability, it allows you to scale the identification of weaknesses that attackers can exploit and appropriate mitigations or requirements across the vast majority of your portfolio. And you can think of this as the ultimate shift left approach to threat modeling, as SD elements helps you eliminate weaknesses that, if left unaddressed, can turn into vulnerabilities that threats target. So ultimately, with SD elements, you are getting ahead of the problem. On the cost reduction side, our platform helps drive down your cybersecurity costs by significantly reducing the effort to do threat modeling. SD elements automate significant aspects of the threat modeling process that otherwise creates a lot of overhead, and not to mention anguish and frustration for both security and development teams. So I'm sure you're all curious to know, what does SD elements do? First, our platform allows you to automatically identify and prioritize preventive security and privacy controls to mitigate weaknesses in your particular technology stack. So not just the software, but also the environment it operates in, whether that's cloud platform like Amazon Web Services or Google Cloud Platform, or traditional web service like Apache, and also other interconnected elements like APIs, firmware, and even IoT devices. But beyond all these technical stuff, our platform also allows you to capture non-technical, i.e. business requirements. Does your system collect personal, financial, or health data? Is it subject to certain industry regulations and standards like the GDPR, HIPAA, and NIST 800-53? And notice that we highlight early and often. We understand that the ability to continuously update threat models is extremely important to many organizations today. And SD elements enable you to do just that, so that you can stay on top of preventive mitigations to reduce your risk. Collaboration is important in many aspects of business, including security. SD elements helps break down barriers and enables stakeholders to contribute in the threat modeling process to reconcile everyone's views. And our platform also gives them the visibility to the status of security weaknesses and mitigations that they care about. Third, SD elements integrate security guidance into development workflows. What does this mean? So our platform makes the process of embedding security and privacy controls into your systems easy for development and engineering teams. So we support integrations with a wide range of development tools such as Jira, Digital.ai, Broadcom Rally, so that your teams can receive security guidance right in the tools they already use. And this helps reduce friction and really focus cross-functional interactions on getting things done with security and compliance as early as possible in the development process. Also, SD elements guides development teams to implement controls during development. Now, to some, this may not seem like an obvious element of threat modeling, but it is an important success factor in reducing the likelihood of successful attacks due to insecure system design. As a balanced development automation platform, SD elements automatically provides coding guidance specific to your system's programming language and technology framework, also provides short just-in-time training videos and code samples to really support the implementation of security and privacy controls during development. So this capability in turn reduces demands on hard-to-find security experts. And lastly, SD elements helps verify the implementation of controls automatically, which can be a tough job. It does this by incorporating vulnerability feedback from scanning tools like Micro Focus, Fortify, and Veracode. So in a nutshell, SD elements allows you to scale threat modeling across your portfolio by reducing the effort to conduct threat modeling, and enables the successful implementation of mitigations or controls during development. So on the next slide, I would like to show you a partial view of the SD elements content library. Our vast library allows our platform to deliver content to your teams specific to their development stack and in a developer-friendly speed, and can accommodate customized content, custom security issues or requirements and controls. if needed. On this slide, I'd like to show you a partial view of our extensive integrations that make it easy for SD elements to fit into any development environment. So I invite you to learn more about SD elements. Do contact us to speak with a solutions engineer, and also have a look at the case study we did with FINRA to learn how they leverage SD elements to mitigate cybersecurity risks via threat modeling with SD elements. So I hope you enjoyed getting a quick overview of SD elements. Back to you, Raquel.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much again, everyone, for joining us. And thank you to our speakers today. It was a great session. Again, we will send an email with a link to the recording. And if you have any questions for our speakers today, please email contact@securitycompass.com. Thank you so much again, and we hope to see you next time.